Hi! During this video, I'll be drawing this eagle. I chose this reference because it caught my attention. I love the composition and the negative space that the body creates. Plus, I feel like the eagle looks powerful, so I felt like drawing it. As I said, when I saw this reference, one of the first things I noticed was the composition. So I'll most likely start my illustration there and see what the next thing that catches my attention is. Draw it, and continue to slowly build up my sketch. To start, I'll turn on my reference tab. To do that, I'll go to the wrench icon and put on the reference tab. I go to Image, Import Image, and I pick the reference I want. Now I can change the size of my reference, zoom in and out, and move it around. And to start, I'll go to the Quick Gesture brush. I decided to start this drawing using the negative space as a reference. So I check the negative space I see between the edge of the image and the wing. I measure the angles I see in the space and transfer them to my drawing. I take some time to look at my reference image before I make my next line. I keep drawing the negative space and measuring the angles that I see there. I measure where the head is in comparison to the wing. I keep measuring where the beak is in comparison to the wing. Now, I start measuring the angles on the beak. I start to follow the shapes and angles on the beak. Continue to sketch the beak. I want you to notice that I'm focusing a lot on the shapes that I see in the negative space of my reference. I'm building up the shape of the eagle by constantly measuring the angles I see in the reference image. Using the information I have of my sketch, I want to triangulate where the eye is in my drawing. So, to do that, I measure where the eye is in comparison to the corner of the beak, then from the same corner to the other side of the eye, and then from the top of the beak to the top of the eye. That way I find out where the eye is in my drawing. I keep building my sketch very slowly, measuring the angles for the neck and the chest. I measure where the foot starts in comparison to the end of the beak. I want to start drawing the other leg, so I look at where the other leg starts in relation to the eye, and draw the angle that I see there. The same for the other side of that leg. I keep building the sketch up little by little, and I continue to draw the feet. I focus on the shapes that I see there. Now, I try to focus on the shapes I see in the features around the face and the neck. As you can see, at this point, I get close and personal with my sketch. I'm sorry about that. That's just a classic case of I'm focused, so I get all over my iPad moment. I'm moving my eyes back into my reference to draw the shapes I see in the eye and around it. I also focus on the shapes I see in the mouth and the tongue. I focus on the angles I see around the beak and the mouth. And I define the eye a little bit more, and the areas around it. I darken the eye and add a little bit more detail. I will start to darken the lines in my sketch because I feel more certain about my sketch at this point. I also take time to define some of the details that I see in my sketch. Now, I add some shadows and darken some areas around the mouth and the whole sketch. I focus on the shapes in the shadows and darken those areas too. I like doing this while I sketch my drawing, because the more information I have in my sketch before I start to render my final drawing, the easier and faster it is for me to create a realistic drawing that resembles my reference. I keep quickly building the shadows where I see them. I take my time and focus on what I see in my reference. I don't focus much on details for now, but in the overall shapes. I want to add dark areas quickly now, so I change my brush to a softer one that would allow me to do that. I choose the Willow Graphite Fill for this, and I start to add the darker areas where I see them around my reference. I blend out the marks I made to soften them a little bit. And I continue building my sketch. You'll see in a moment that I make a mistake here. I start to build the shadows without having any structure to the feathers. And this will come back to haunt me later. I just haven't realized that yet. But now I change the color of my background to match the reference more. Using the same soft brush, I take a darker tone and I start to add the darker areas I see in the background. On a new layer, I take a lighter tone and I add a base color for the eagle. I use the Yummy pencil fill brush for this. I'm just following my sketch to do this. After I was done with this, I realized that I chose a darker color than I needed. So I took a lighter tone and I dropped it into the eagle. At this point, I recognize there is something that just feels a bit off. So I start to turn on and off different layers, and I'm able to see what my mistake is. I see that the shadows look a bit off, and that's because there's no structure to them. So I choose a sharper brush for this. I choose the raw pencil, and I start to define the shapes I see in the feathers. I see that the feathers are like triangles. So I start to add those triangles to my sketch. This way, it'll be easier for me to see where the shadows really are. Now at this point, I realize that the shadows that I made previously are just in my way. They're not giving me any information about the shadows, the feathers, or anything, honestly. So I turn off that layer and I forget that it ever existed. And I want you to notice this. I saw that something wasn't working in my drawing, so instead of getting frustrated or giving up, I took my time to analyze and find what was not working, and I just let it go. Now I keep adding triangular shapes to make the feathers, and add information to my sketch. Once I'm done with this, I choose a darker tone and I start to bring in some of the shadows to my drawing. I pay close attention to the reference and add darker areas where I see them. I want a brush that allows me to make the feathers, so I choose the Willow textured pencil. I feel like this brush is great for the texture of feathers or even fur. And start to add the darker areas where I see them in the leg. I keep building it up with soft strokes. I take a step back to see my reference and I keep on building up the drawing. The darker the area in my reference, the darker the tone I use. Using the Uniform Blend brush, I smudge and soften the strokes. With a light medium tone, I keep adding to my illustration. I darken the tone a bit and following my reference, I add the feathers on the leg. Using a lighter tone, I add some light to the leg where I see it in my reference. I continue to add value to my drawing. I keep building my drawing up this way. With a dark value, I add the dark feathers I see in the corner of the canvas. And I start to add the darker areas and values where I see them. I also start to darken the shadows that the feathers make. To do this, I pay attention to the reference and follow my sketch. I look for the shapes that the biggest shadows make. And instead of just filling it all in, I take time to make sure that the texture of the feathers is there. I keep adding to the shadows of this section. I go in with a lighter tone and continue to work on this section. I'm still paying close attention to my reference and the changes of value that I see there. But I'm also not rendering these feathers to a hyper-realistic point or anything. I try to render them enough so that you can see feathers, but I want the main focus of my illustration to be on the face. So I'll render everything else a bit less than I will the face. This will guide the viewer's eye to the main focus point that I set. I found that doing this also makes your illustration more appealing, because it allows the eye to rest around the focus point. I darken the shadows here a bit because I noticed that they're darker in my reference than in my drawing. I add a few highlights in this area and I make sure to pay attention to the reference. With a medium tone, I start to work on the neck. With this medium tone, I continue to add lighter and lighter shadows around the head, where I see that the light hits the most. I start working on some of the shadows I see around the face. And I try to keep a line at the bottom of the face for the reflected light I see in the reference. With a darker value, I darken some of the shadows. I can see that I need to keep darkening the shadows around the neck to separate the face from the body. I want to separate the two because the body is much darker and the light is hitting mainly around the face. I continue working on this. With a lighter color, I add some highlights on the feathers, where I see that there's more light in the reference. I also add some of the lighter value to the reflected light underneath the head. And in the fluffy feathers on the legs. I make a new layer, and with an even lighter value, I keep adding to the light. I turn on the layer of shadows I did at the beginning, just to see how it looks. I like how it looks, but I need to play with the opacity of it a bit. I turn off the layers with the lines for a moment, because I want to make sure that the shadows are looking good. Once the lines are off, I start to clean my drawing a bit and define it more. I turn on the layer with the lines and start to build the light around the face. I zoom in on my reference and keep building the lighter areas in the head. With a medium value, I add the shadows underneath the eyebrow and around the eye. With this same value, I work on the shadow areas. This way, the shadow areas and the light areas become more cohesive. I keep adding darker values to my drawing. I zoom out and spend some time looking at my reference to see where to continue. I decide to continue with the wing. With the same brush and a dark value, I start to add volume to that wing. And I use lighter and lighter values where I see that my reference is lighter. Just like with the body, I'm trying to draw this wing without many details. This helps me keep the focus of my drawing on the face. I keep working on the wing and adding different values to it. But I don't focus too much on the tiny details, just on the bigger shapes in the shadows and the differences in value. Now I use a lighter medium value to add some highlights. I noticed that my drawing needs to be darker, so I make a new layer and I set it to multiply. And with a softer brush, I add shadows. I'm using the soft graphite fill brush for that. And as you can see, I get all up close and personal with my iPad again on this part. Sorry about that. I continue to darken the shadows. Now, I noticed that I got too excited with the shadow layer. It's a bit darker than it needs to be. So I take that layer and lower the opacity of it. Now I start working on the face. I zoom in into the eye and start to render it. I pay close attention to the reference and begin to add the details. I want the eye to be the most detailed part of my drawing, so I changed my brush to the raw pencil. This brush is great for details, and I continue to build the details on the eye. I zoom out to see how the eye looks in comparison to the rest of my drawing. And I like how it's looking, so I start to add details around the eye and the face. As I said, I want the eye and the face to be the most detailed part to attract the focus of the viewer to that area. With quick curvy lines, I work on the feathers of the face. I keep adding details with a slightly lighter value. I try to use my whole value scale and work from darker to lighter values. I use different levels of pressure on my Apple Pencil to add these details. I add more highlights to the eye. I add very light details around the feathers of the body, but not a lot. I also add some light details around the legs and wings. I continue working on the face and add details to that area. Now, I'll start to work on the beak. So with a dark value, I follow the reference and work on the beak. I change to the Yummy Graphite Fill brush and start to work on the shadows around the beak. I'll continue working on the mouth and the beak. I work on the highlights that I see. I see there's some light bouncing at the edge of the beak, so I use a lighter value to add this bounce light. I carry that bounce light to the feathers on the neck and other areas where I see it in my reference. I work on the legs and the claws now. I don't add many details to this part, again to keep the focus on the eye and the face. I choose the willow texture brush once again, and with a medium value I work on the long feathers on the leg. I work on a few highlights on the leg and the wing. I start to play with the layers of my drawing, turning some of them off and some on, just to see how my drawing would look with different layers on and off. I noticed that I wanted my eagle to pop out more from the page. So I chose a darker value and I added it to the background. I lowered the opacity of this layer to see some of the background that I drew before. I keep on playing with my layer and experimenting with different things. To finish my drawing, I decide that I want to add a bit more interest to the background. So I choose the dirty crosshatch brush with a medium value and I go all over the background. I change to the graphite dust and with a lighter value I go on top of different parts of my drawing. And I do the same with a darker value. I like finishing my drawings with textures like that because I feel like it adds personality to the artwork. That's how I drew this reference image. As I mentioned before, this process might look a bit different for you, and that's okay. You just want to make sure to compare your drawing to the reference and continue finding the next piece of your puzzle. And the drawing process will change depending on the reference you have. I used all the tools you learned in this course, but not in one particular order. And if you get frustrated because the illustration is not working for you, try not to get discouraged. Just take time to compare your reference and be prepared to let go of what's not working for you, even if this means starting over. You saw me do this in more than one illustration so far. It's as much a part of my drawing process as the rest of the tools you've learned in this course. If I feel the drawing is not going as I wanted, I take a short break and come back to it with fresh eyes. Once I'm back, it's easier for me to see the problem and fix it. In the next video, I'll share with you my brush strategy to render these illustrations realistically, and how I organize my brushes. All the tips in this video will help you make the most out of your digital brushes. See you there!